I'm Louise Edensor from Middlesex University in Dubai. Thank you so much for accepting my abstract for this innovative and interesting conference. My paper concerns The Native Companion, which was an early 20th century little magazine of Australian life, literature and art that would give a voice to an Australian genius. It ran for only 2 volumes, featuring 12 issues from January to December 1907, and is largely remembered as the magazine in which Catherine Mansfield published her first short stories. My paper is concerned with the editor of the last 6 issues, E.J. Brady, who was fervently nationalistic, lobbying local government for protection for local Australian writers. Brady was a journalist, a poet, a writer of short stories, and of a travel narrative entitled The King's Caravan, which he serialised in The Native Companion. This presentation examines Brady's desire to protect Australian writers and examines some of the short stories published in The Native Companion under his editorship to explore the interplay between his promotion of a homegrown Australian literature and that of transnational, nascent, modernist aesthetics. This is E.J. Brady and the cover of the magazine as he redesigned it for the last 6 issues. In the magazine in May, an announcement had been made that in order to give a voice to Australian genius, which will be something more than the photographic repetition of our own literary policy, we've decided not to adopt a literary policy at all. John Webb, in his unpublished PhD thesis, admires Brady's enthusiasm, but remarks that this is an example of his flamboyancy and the desire to achieve an effect, but without full concern for the implications of the activity. An open literary policy for Brady, however, was part of his strategy to encourage the publication of Australian genius. Brady's nationalistic vision centred around the disenfranchisement of local writers as a result of the importation of foreign literature. Brady remarks that as long as the cheap print of England and Germany and the United States is allowed to enter Australian ports duty-free, there will be no room for any more printers, papermakers, type founders, machinists, bookbinders, and starvation will remain chronic with those who write and design. Brady's enthusiasm for national literature was nothing new. Elizabeth Webby highlights how many of the 19th century magazines encouraged national literature with what she refers to as pious comments on the moral value of literature in new countries, magazines which sadly would close after a year or 2. She concludes that the questions and answers, the nationalistic stance, the comparisons with America, the confident belief in future greatness were to echo and re-echo in the pages of Australian newspapers and magazines throughout the 19th century. Brady, then, was picking up the baton in the 20th century, 6 years after Australia was freed from colonial rule. Whilst poignant and nationalistic, Brady's policy was, however, battling against the currents of established literary journals noted for their Australian bush narratives, like the Bulletin and the Lone Hand, for example. But he was also battling against local conservatism. In the introduction to the Index of the Native Companion, Carol Mills reflects on how the publication was, for that place and period, audacious. Melbourne, a city without Sunday morning newspapers or trams, always reactionary, materialistic and conservative on the surface, and as vicious underneath, needed that healthy bohemianism which is conducive to cultural expression and free thinking. Whilst it might have needed bohemianism, it might not necessarily have been open to it. Bruce Bennett articulates this as the editor's paradox. How can they encourage fresh, lively, innovative writing on Australian subjects and also transmit such writing to a reading public if that public is not interested or ready for it? From these various viewpoints, I can surmise that Brady's quest meant placing himself in an equivocal position. He wanted to promote a national literature that would be acceptable to the reading public of Melbourne and beyond, but that was also in dialogue with the imported literature from Europe and America that resonated with a burgeoning modernism. In short, a literature that would be recognisably Australian, but that could also compete on an international stage. Initially, Brady's fervency for an Australian literature was attached to his attempts to protect Australian writers. He said, "Every Australian writer and artist that I have known in 20 years' association has been fervidly patriotic, profoundly anxious to see Australia take her place among the great nations of the earth. Yet our writers and artists have left and are leaving Australia by nearly every outbound steamer, starved out. A state of affairs such as this is little short of a national calamity." He calls upon the government for a Copyright Act, for the writers of Australia, for the artists, the thinkers, the creators of books, periodicals, illustrated magazines, pictures. We must have protection to battle against unrestricted importation. Brady's editorial policy was to attract Australian writers and writing. The danger in this policy was that it appeared exclusionary. It establishes a clear dichotomy between Australian literature and nascent or emergent forms of modernism imported in the literature of Europe and the US. Literature is, by nature, however, dialogic, and as Eric White argues, transatlantic exchanges were a fundamental aspect of the localist aesthetic. Despite Brady's devotion to Australian writers, the open-door editorial policy of the magazine would suggest that Brady was aware of the developmental nature of a homegrown literature. However, to complicate matters further, issues of nationalism in Australia were also intricately tied to issues of gender. I want to just briefly consider how Susan Sheridan's work on Australian literature of the late 19th century adds to Brady's predicament. Sheridan defines a set of oppositions that crystallise the debates around the establishment of Australian literary and cultural aesthetics in the late 19th century. These, she argues, become cemented into the suppressed opposition of masculinity and femininity, thus defining the distinctively Australian tradition as masculine. She goes on to remark that the bush comes to signify nationalism, literary originality, and by implication, masculinity. Brady would seem to subvert these established oppositions in a story published in the October issue of the magazine entitled Brunhild of the Beach by Alex Montgomery. Brunhild is a character from Norse legend, a powerful female figure who vows to marry only a man of outstanding qualities, but is tricked into marrying someone else. The native companion short story begins with the words, "This Little History," pointing to the bush adventure stories, but in its execution it serves to show how the order of traditional aesthetic expectations can quickly be reversed. In this narrative, the bush is no longer the place of masculine exploration, a monstrous place in which men may perish or be absorbed, as Kay Schaffer has defined it, but conversely, a place of refuge for a woman. The protagonist finds is abroad on the river and loses his matches. In seeking new ones, he notices smoke from a fisherman's crib, alights, and goes in search of the crib's inhabitant. The narrative utilises the rhetoric of the adventure story. The man felt that he did indeed cut a sufficiently ludicrous figure, hopping rapidly from change of front to change of front to avoid the flank attack of his nimble assailant. The woman he meets has a coarsely handsome face and adopts a man fashion, speaks in the vernacular, but evidently has some refinement, as she is a reader of Kipling. She perplexes Vines as she switches casually to and fro from the hard, high twang of the Sydney larrikiness to the low-level tones of a contralto-voiced woman of culture. The conversation turns to marriage, and the woman asserts, "I'll get married all right when I want to, but when I am married, I'll be top dog all the same, and don't you forget it." The narrative ends on a note of deep irony when Fiennes encounters the woman again, but this time in a restaurant in town, married to an abhorrent man who has caused her boldly featured countenance to become subdued almost to timidity. It would seem that this narrative then subverts the concept of the bush as a place of danger for a man when it becomes a place of refuge for a woman. This small but significant twist would suggest that Brady was open to the idea that an Australian aesthetic did not necessarily mean adherence to conservative ideals of traditional and established ideologies, but conversely could be generated from an intertextuality that reveals a more dialogic approach. As I discussed earlier, of key concern for Brady was that Australian literature was being sidelined by the literatures imported from Europe and the US. This did not mean, however, that Australian literature had necessarily to establish itself in opposition to those narratives. As David Carter has warned, modernism can be argued into being an opposite of nationalism. An important step taken by Brady, Gelder and Weaver argue, is that he drew together a group of newer women writers whose work gave the native companion a feminine aesthetic more attuned to emergent forms of literary modernism. Alex Montgomery's Brunhild story and Brady's own bush adventure, The King's Caravan, are nestled between vignettes by Catherine Mansfield, Sumner Locke and Sidney Partridge. These vignettes cover a variety of subject matters, from the plight of a bored female office clerk overseen by an officious and stupid man, to the devastating inner realisation of a poor girl whose recent acquired riches have been obtained at a personal price. These vignettes are illustrative of early 20th century writers' attempts to reveal the inner workings of their characters in their depiction of inner consciousness and emotion. Brady's deliberate integration of vignettes written by women would seem to suggest that, for him at least, the ideology of a nationalist literature in the Native Companion did not hold with the binary oppositional positions of what constituted a masculine or a feminine aesthetic, nor what could be defined as Australian versus modernist literatures. Gelder and Weaver highlight, in fact, how Mansfield's stories helped to open up connections between colonial identity and literary modernism in the Native Companion. And Chris Morant has more recently argued that Mansfield looked to undermine the magazine's focus on the local native landscape as the space in which this modernism would be formulated. Mansfield's vignettes feature a homodiegetic narrator observing the outside world of the city from a bedroom window. Kimber has highlighted how in this story, clearly present is the influence of Oscar Wilde, and there is much symbolism. But Mansfield goes beyond that in employing liminal spaces as positions for her characters, evoking the idea of the city as a place of refuge for those characters where the boundaries of convention can be questioned and subjectivities explored. Multiple contrasts combine to create a mise-en-scene of intoxicating madness, where the city whispers. The sounds and sights are mingled and contrasted. There is the passing of many feet, lines of flaring lights, night music, and the sound of laughter, half sad, half joyous, creating a kaleidoscopic index of feelings and emotions. These powerful evocations of feeling illustrate the development in the magazine of a fledgling modernism that, despite being curated locally, although Mansfield was from New Zealand and not Australia, does not rely upon the traditional characteristics of the bush narratives for its subject matter. There's not time here to look at any of the vignettes in detail, but only to surmise that Brady's relationship with this set of artists and writers was symbiotic. In order to further the plight of Australian authors, he would need to keep the magazine alive, to give them a space in which to publish, but he also needed to embrace the artistic flair of emergent movements like modernism to maintain the competitiveness of Australian literatures. The vignettes published within the magazine by the female authors seem to bridge that gap. As Bruce Bennett argues, many writers testify that they would not have written what they did in the way they did without knowing they had sympathetic or appropriate outlets. Bennett concludes that magazines and newspapers provide no mirror image of literary activity. They are perceived more accurately as a number of refracting prisms shaped by personality, ideological bias, geographical location, and other factors. Brady was fervently in favour of protecting Australian writers, but he also seems to have been aware that poetics are conversant. And despite his nationalism and his drive to promote Australian writers, he is not resistant to, nor hostile towards, other forms of writing that neither originate in Australia nor address any aspect of Australian culture. The vignettes published in the magazine suggest that Brady is aware that a homegrown poetics is one that is in dialogue with other traditions and aesthetics, and his desire to protect an Australian literature did not necessarily mean that it had to reject Western literary styles in its burgeoning formulation. I hope you've enjoyed this working paper. I'm looking forward to continuing this research to look in more depth at the short stories published by Brady in the coming months. Thank you.